there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is End Time Newsman, Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. Today is Friday, June 15, 2012. Warning, be alert this weekend. Watch for signs of a European financial panic that could spread around the world next week. We are at an extreme danger level today, and I urge you to be very aware of world affairs over the next 72 hours. For weeks, I've heard rumors that a Lehman Brothers type of event would happen in June or July. And a week or two ago, I reported that a rumor spread during a luncheon of hedge fund directors that summer vacations had been canceled by major financial corporations because they wanted all hands on deck. I saw two very alarming articles this afternoon from the Reuters Newswire. Article number 1 says, urgent messages flashed on cell phones, email alerts popped up, and telephone extensions rang at the desk of a team at asset manager Legg Mason on Friday. Dial in to a conference now, the 30-strong enterprise risk management team was told. A major event is underway. This time, it was a drill, but what the Maryland-based company wants to be prepared for is any fallout if Greece leaves the euro. Companies across the globe are on similar high alert this weekend as Greeks vote in an election on Sunday that could decide the future of the European single currency. Father's Day celebrations have been canceled for some, and the head of a billion-dollar Hong Kong-based hedge fund is among those dropping holiday plans to prepare for any disruption. Such wargaming has become routine for companies, particularly in the financial services, as the Eurozone crisis has intensified. But the Greek vote has assumed greater significance. The Reuters article goes on to say, victory for the leftist party Syriza, which opposes the terms of an international bailout, could make an exit from the Eurozone look more likely. In Asia, where markets will be the first to react to the voting results, banks are calling in extra staff, some much earlier than usual. The article quotes Toby Lawson, Asia Pacific head of financial futures and options and cash equities for a company called New Edge. He said, we're on code red. Asia is the first out of the block, so across the region, we've got IT and solution staff in early. It's likely to be a lot more frantic given the volatility expected in the market. The Reuters article said in Hong Kong, traders plan to show up as early as 2 a.m. That's 9 p.m. in Athens, to be at their screens when the news comes in. New Zealand has a 4-hour start on Hong Kong. The Swiss National Bank said it will intervene to prevent a huge appreciation in the Swiss franc if there is a flight from the euro to the Swiss currency. Drug companies have already had to adapt to asking for cash on delivery to deliver pharmaceutical drugs to Greek hospitals. Now, the second article from Reuters. Again, both of these articles came out on the Newswire this afternoon. This one says, officials of the G20 leading nations told Reuters on Thursday central banks of major economies would take steps to stabilize markets and prevent a credit squeeze if necessary. Authorities in the world's major economies are preparing for a possible market storm or public panic after the Greek elections this weekend. Officials from the G20 nations, whose leaders are meeting in Mexico next week, said that central banks around the world are ready to take steps to stabilize financial markets if needed by providing liquidity and prevent any credit squeeze after Sunday's election. Canada is ready to act if the situation takes a serious turn for the worse or if there is an external shock, said Andrew McDougall, a spokesman for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Central banks from major economies stand ready to stabilize the financial markets by providing liquidity. A senior U.S. official cautioned that the Greek election will not provide the definitive signal on what happens next in the Eurozone. But if the severe market strains emerge after an unusual confluence of three elections this weekend, Greece, Egypt, and France, central bankers are on standby to ensure enough cash is flowing through the global financial system. The article quotes one source concerning the G20 meeting as saying, quote, the central banks are preparing for coordinated action to provide liquidity. This is a senior G20 aide familiar with discussions among international financial diplomats, who went on to say that a move to boost liquidity could mark a dramatic backdrop to the G20 summit of world leaders gathering in Mexico on Monday. Now, just how shaky is the world banking system? Sir Mervyn King, governor of the Bank of England, said today that banks across Europe urgently need a major recapitalization to rebuild their solvency buffers. Notice that he used the word solvency. He said they need a major recapitalization to rebuild their solvency buffers. In plain English, it means the banks are insolvent and they need a truckload of cash. That's what the governor was saying. The Bank of England chief announced this morning in London emergency measures to shore up British banks to ride out a possible European banking storm next week. He called the situation the most serious crisis confronting Great Britain since World War II. He announced that the central bank would infuse the UK banking system with another $157 billion in liquidity. So what is the state of some of the world's biggest banks? Moody's Investor Service yesterday downgraded some of the biggest banks in Belgium and the Netherlands. And if you recall, Moody's said last February that it was carefully watching 17 major banks around the world. Now, 2 of those banks have already been downgraded by Moody's. So how much damage would the other banks incur if their credit worthiness is downgraded this summer by Moody's because of the European crisis? Well, I've got a list of those banks. Bank of America would take a $3.5 billion hit. Royal Bank of Scotland, $19.4 billion hit. Also on that list of banks that could be downgraded any day, Societe Generale of France, Barclays of Great Britain, BNP Paribas of France, Citigroup here in the United States, a $1.1 billion hit. French bank Crédit Agricole, the German bank Deutsche Bank, a $312 billion hit. Goldman Sachs, $6.8 billion loss. HSBC, JP Morgan, $4.7 billion loss. Royal Bank of Canada, $6.7 billion loss. Credit Suisse, $4.8 billion. Morgan Stanley, $9.5 billion. UBS of Switzerland, $7.3 billion. Now, economist Dr. Nouriel Roubini said today that the world is facing a perfect storm. Where have I heard that before? Oh, I've said it here on True News. Now, Dr. Roubini is saying it. He told readers of his column today that the world is facing dark financial and economic clouds from Europe, the USA, China, and the Middle East. And as the European and American financial systems careen back and forth like runaway trains, both continents continue to move away from Christianity. It was announced yesterday that the U.S. Department of Defense will celebrate for the first time Gay Pride Month in June. This is the first time ever that the Defense Department has officially celebrated homosexuality. Does anybody make the connection between the decline of morality and the worsening financial state of Western nations? Europe and America are financially bankrupt because they are morally bankrupt. And as a pastor, I must go on record as saying that at this point in time, no Christian man in America can now morally justify serving in the U.S. Armed Services. How can you participate in a gay army? It is time for American pastors to tell young men in their congregations, do not enlist in the American Armed Forces. I never thought I would ever say such a thing, but we have deteriorated so far as a nation that we have to draw a line. And if the pastors would have the backbone to make these announcements in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of churches, and the military recruiters could not find anyone from the heartland of America to join the military, I assure you that they would change their policies. Barack Obama is the most evil man ever to occupy the White House. He has spiritually sodomized the American Armed Forces. He has introduced homosexuality into the military. And sadly, the generals and top officers have allowed him to do it. Shame on them. I have lost respect for the military leadership in the United States. Our military was the last bastion of decency in America, and now it has been defiled, and we will deserve the punishment that is coming to this nation. One final note, Emperor Obama decreed today that 800,000 illegal immigrants in the United States will now be granted amnesty, thus allowing them to legally work in America and compete with American citizens for jobs in the worst economic climate since the Great Depression. Yes, he did it for votes, but more importantly, he did it to provoke fury and anger in the American middle class because he wants race riots and civil war. I'm Rick Wiles. You're listening to True News. I'll take a break, and I'll be back in a moment with my guest.
You're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast. Rick will return after this announcement.
Fatherhood is a special calling from God. Here's a moment with Charles Stanley.
Dad, I want to tell you something. You're responsible for being a godly father. You're responsible for being the kind of father those children need to raise them in a way that they too will become godly and live the kind of righteous life that will bring you honor as their dad. Father, listen to me. You're responsible for teaching them to read the Word of God. You're responsible for teaching them how to pray. You're responsible for bringing them, taking them to church, finding the kind of church that you can trust your children to hear what will grow them up, teach them to be godly, and give them the principles they need to live by. You are responsible for that. You say, well, I don't even go to church. Then get started. It's your responsibility. I'll let the wife do that. That's not her responsibility. She's to be a partner in that, but you're the head of the home. You cannot divest your responsibility even to the most godly wife and be acceptable in the eyes of God. God doesn't accept that as an excuse. And so you're responsible. Materially, that's not enough. Emotionally, absolutely essential. Spiritually, absolutely essential. And it's very simple. Get down by the bed with your children at night and pray with them. You say, my kids are teenagers. You know what? They need it worse than your 5-year-olds. They're the ones who are going through the temptations and the trials and the heartaches and situations and circumstances. Listen, no kid, I don't care who he is, how tough, how weird he might be, when he goes to sleep at night is you as a father, if you walked in and knelt down beside his bed and said, son or sweetheart, to your daughter, I just want you to know that I love you. No matter what you're going through, I love you, and I care for you, and I want to talk to God on your behalf. You think he's going or she's going to ignore that? Absolutely not. It doesn't make any difference what they say. God will rivet that into a heart like a bullet fired straight to their soul. They'll never be able to get over hearing the Father pray, and the Father say, I love you, and the Father say, I care, and the Father say, I'm going to stand beside you, no matter what's going on in your life.
Only a man who has accepted Christ as his Savior can be this kind of a dad. Learn about becoming a Christian when you visit us at intouch.org.
Well, welcome back to segment 2 of True News for Friday, June 15, 2012. I'm Rick Wiles. All eyes are on Greece this weekend. Investors, bankers, and world leaders will be watching to see the results of Sunday's voting for the Greek parliament. It's believed that if an anti-bailout coalition wins control, it's expected that Greece will be booted out of the euro monetary zone. As I told you yesterday, one large Swiss foreign currency trader has suspended all trading activity until after Sunday's elections because it says the company's strategists believe there could be some type of major currency event. Meanwhile, the Bank of England today pumped another $157 billion into the British banking system to keep the country's zombie banks walking. How long can central banks continue these extraordinary bailouts? When does it stop? Australian economist Steve Keen is on the telephone. He is an associate professor of economics at the University of Western Sydney, known in his country as a renegade economist. He has shared this stage with people such as George Soros, Joseph Stiglitz, and Paul Krugman. Professor Keen is the author of the book Debunking Economics. His website is debtdeflation.com. Professor Keen, welcome to True News.
Thank you, Rick.
Professor, at the heart of the global financial crisis is a debt problem. And, you know, you really don't need a doctorate degree in economics to know that a financial system built on debt will eventually implode. Where is this leading us?
Well, a financial system based on debt can actually work so long as people use that debt productively. They go out and invest and produce, both new factories and new technologies, and then that enables you to pay the debt off. When it's going to implode is when the money is borrowed to go and gamble on rising house prices or rising share prices, and that's precisely how the money was wasted in the last 20 years, obviously, in America, and also, unfortunately, around most of the rest of the globe. And it's ignoring that factor, which is actually the reason why we walked into this entire crisis blindfolded.
So in your opinion, debt is not the problem; it's the use of the debt.
Yeah. A financial system with debt, one of the many myths that I see out in looking at how people analyse money is a myth that's on the popular side of economics. So a public view is that if you borrow $100 and the bank insists you pay 5% interest, you've only got 100, you've got to pay back 105, and you can't manage to do it. That's a fairly common attitude in public circles about money. On the other hand, you have people like Paul Krugman and the conventional economists who don't even believe debt matters at all, because they say debt is simply you and me swapping money. I'm an impatient person. I borrow $100 off you. You're a patient person. Your spending power goes down. Mine goes up. There's no overall effect. Both those arguments are wrong. And if I can take the first one about not being able to, if you borrow $100 and you've got to pay 105 back and you can't do it, that's confusing a stock with a flow, which is a common pastime in economics, unfortunately. Because if you borrow $100, that's $100. Like literally, if I said, what have you got there, you'd say $100. The $5 is $5 per annum. That's the responsibility. You've got to pay $5 per annum to me. Now, with that $100, you might be able to hire somebody to work for you for a period of time and produce $10 worth of goods. That could be in over a 2 or 3 day basis. You extend that for an entire year, and that $100, which you've got to then service $5 worth at the end of the year, could generate $200 or $300 worth of business activity for you. You could pay the person you hired something, a wage which might be half that. You take the other half as profit, and you've got to hand over $5 to the bank. It's not difficult. So the mistake is the simple confusion of an amount of money which you can denominate in dollars with the income flow that generates, which is dollar per unit of time. And there's no reason that one is a limit on the other.
Professor, decades ago, people would make investments such as stocks where they expected to hold those stocks for many, many years, decades in their portfolio. But somewhere along the line, we moved into a system where people are flipping stocks, by the hour. Is speculation and greed playing a major part in this crisis?
Yes, definitely. That's a very major issue, because back when you bought stocks and held them for a long time, your attitude was, I'm going to live off the dividends. And also the firm poured some of the profit it made back into its investments, and then retained earnings would be reinvested and the company would grow in value. So you had those two quite legitimate reasons to expect to get money out of holding a share for the long term. Now what's happening is people are gambling on the share price rising on almost on a millisecond basis. And they flip that. They're trying to get rich by playing flip that share with other speculators. Now, the reality, the only way that in the majority, most of those speculators can come out ahead is if people are borrowing more money over time to buy the shares. So what you're actually doing is capitalizing growing debt levels. And that's why the hedge fund market looked like a bunch of geniuses for the last 20 years. Now they're starting to look like a bunch of morons. All the way through, they were simply riding a debt bubble, because the level of private debt in America went from something close to about 100% of GDP back in the mid-60s to early 70s to 3 times that, over 300% of GDP. By the time of the peak of the crisis. And that was all basically borrowing money to go and gamble in a casino. Now, if you go and do that, in the aggregate, you've got to lose money. And the only way you can continue doing the gambling is the bank continues to lend you money to go to the casino. Well, at some point the bank says no, or you say no. That's precisely what's happened in the global economy.
Professor, back in, I think it was around August, September 2004, I started telling my radio audience, particularly in the United States, that the real estate market was going to crash and that they should make plans to get out of real estate if they were purchasing properties for the purpose of flipping them. And, throughout 2006 and 2007, I was giving my radio audience almost a daily update on the coming liquidity crisis. The point I'm making is I'm not a trained economist. I'm not a billionaire investor, but I saw it coming because I just paid attention to people like you who made sense. Okay, why didn't the experts see it?
Rick, that's an extremely good question. I'm glad you did your listeners a great favour of imparting that wisdom over that time, because you're quite right. It's almost blindingly obvious that this is going to happen, because, frankly, when you think about it, we can't all get rich by selling second-hand houses to each other. And that's the only wisdom you need. That's all you need to know about why it was going to fail. But the reality is that economists are actually trained monkeys, trained idiots. I heard once educated idiots was a way that I had them describe once. And it's true, because they learn a set of notions which are described by the Latin a priori, meaning before the event, a set of a priori notions about how things operate. And that those a priori notions, they ignore the real world around them. So one of them is that key one I mentioned a while ago, to say the level of debt doesn't matter, because, if you borrow from me, I can spend less, you can spend more. In the aggregate, there's no effect. That's completely ignoring the real-world way in which banks actually operate, which, putting it quite in a cliche sort of way, banks can create money out of nothing simply by double-entry bookkeeping. It's more complicated than that, but that's a reasonable summary. So they can increase spending power by giving somebody a loan without taking spending power away from somebody else. But that sort of a priori notion goes hand in hand with a whole lot of others, where they think, for example, rising houses represent rising wealth. Now, of course, what rising houses really represent is rising money borrowed to buy them. and ultimately a crisis has to come along. So it is not amazing that I saw it coming, or even that you saw it coming beforehand. What's amazing is so many intelligent people didn't see it coming, and that's a sign of how blinded they are by insane notions in economics, which is why I wrote Debunking Economics.
All right. Well, the other thing that is insane is that the same experts who didn't see it coming now want us to trust them to fix it.
Yeah. This again is because we have it as a species. We have to trust the experts overall because we live in an incredibly complex physical environment which we designed ourselves. You know, we don't hang from trees anymore. We hop into elevators instead. And if the elevator breaks down, you call the elevator repairman to fix it because you know the elevator wouldn't be there, except if the elevator inventors made elevators. So you and I don't, we don't go down to Allen keys at the elevator jams. We press the button and call the expert. And we apply exactly the same belief to economists and the belief they're experts as well. The great tragedy is they're not. They are instead, because economics is such an area where ideology and belief gets in the way, there's a particular bunch of ideologues who took over the economics profession in opposition to the Marxist ideologues of the late 19th century, and they put up, unfortunately, just as false a vision as the simplified vision of Marx that people who call themselves Marxists normally follow. So we actually have effectively a bunch of ideologues or ideologues running it who don't actually know they're ideological. And that is the great problem. We therefore think they're experts because they're economists. They must be experts because they know the economy exists. But unlike a lift, you don't need an economist to make an economy. The economy exists anyway. So they are not as essential as experts like, a lift repairer is to make a lift function. But we endow them with the same respect because that's what we're used to doing with experts. And that's why I wrote Debunking Economics again, to make the point that they are not experts and we need to actually design a version of economics which is as reliable and genuine as engineering is about how the engineering world operates. Unfortunately, we're decades from that point before we'll finally have a non-ideological version of economics.
Professor, last weekend, 17 finance ministers in the European Union came up with over what was $125 billion US dollars for a bailout of the Spanish banking system. I don't think they really explained where that money was coming from. Nigel Farage, who is a member of the European Parliament, said the other day that Italy will be required to loan, I forget the amount of money, I think perhaps $20 billion to the Spanish banking system at 3%. And he said the Italian government will have to borrow it at 7% to loan it to the Spanish system at 3%. So you can already see it's already designed for failure. But then again, today we learned that the Bank of England has pumped in $157 billion US dollars into the British banking system. So we have these insolvent banks that we call zombie banks receiving bailouts from insolvent governments, which are zombie governments. When does this stop?
Well, I think it's only going to stop when, first of all, two things are appreciated. First of all, creating money is a book entry operation. It's not a case of having to dig the stuff out of the ground as it was with gold. So it's bookkeeping operations that are going on. But at the same time, you can have a level of debt in your books which simply cannot be repaid. In fact, if you have $1 billion in debt and your income is $100,000 a year, it doesn't matter how many times they reschedule the debt, you're not going to be able to repay it. So those two realizations have to come together, and as my good friend Michael Hudson puts it brilliantly and very simply, debts that can't be repaid won't be repaid. Now, instead, what's going on is that the governments around the world are attempting to validate impossible private debt by creating impossible public debt. And the reality is you can't do that. You simply have to abolish the private debt. And that's one reason I put forward what I call a modern jubilee, where rather than abolishing the debt as we would have been able to do in the old days, because the banks have also sold a lot of this toxic garbage to people as investments, and they would be unwillingly damaged if we actually simply abolish the debt. We have to find a way of neutralizing the impact of debt in the economy and reducing the debt load and increasing effectively the fiat load in the money system so we don't have this crisis. So I'd be in favour of abolishing in a very careful way something like about 80% of the 100% of GDP debt level that American households own right now, because most of that debt was borrowed to gamble on rising house prices. So we simply have to make the realization we have got ourselves in an impossible situation. We have to reverse direction. The trouble is that whatever all these governments are doing, the Europeans are the worst by far, is trying to get out of the problem by going further down the route that caused it.
I'm fascinated that you just said a debt jubilee, because back in January of 2009, I said on this radio program that I believe a global jubilee will be the only solution.
Yeah.
And the very next day, it was Ambrose Evans Pritchard in the London Telegraph, and he wrote an editorial stating that we're headed towards a debt jubilee. So you are saying that this is the solution. That there's going to have to be some type of global cancellation of debt.
Yes, definitely. And it's something which, I mean, if you look back to the turn of the millennia before this disaster began, people like Anne Pettifor's in England began a debt jubilee program for the third world, and that was very effective. If you're giving third world government debts their debts to the first world, which is a very sensible thing, worked very effectively. But ironically, not realizing at the same time we were generating unsustainable debts for ourselves in the first world. And now we have to get out of that via a debt jubilee. But the complication this time round is because the banks not only produce too much debt, and it's the banks that are responsible for this, you can't blame the borrowers. The borrowers don't have 150 guys with PhDs working out whether they should or shouldn't take out a loan. The bank does have thousands of people with PhDs working out how to convince people to take on more debt. So the responsibility lies with the lender. But as well as doing that, they also parceled the stuff up, called it securities, and sold it to the public, equally unwittingly, believing they were buying genuine assets. So we can't just abolish the debt, because that would bankrupt people who are savers and people who genuinely bought those investments in the justified belief that they could trust the financial system. And what I've talked about is what I call a modern jubilee, or in colloquial terms, given how Ben Bernanke has defined this, quantitative easing for the public. We'd generate money through the government's double-entry bookkeeping operation and give it to the public, but on condition that if you had debt, you had to pay the debt down. So let's say the sum was $100,000 per household. If a household owed $150,000, they'd be paid their debt down to $50,000, then their financial system would be otherwise the same. A household that had no debt would have $100,000. The impact would then be that the financial sector would have to reduce the value that it currently writes its loans at, and of course anybody who owned assets based on those loans would have a diminished cash flow coming out of those assets, but they'd be compensated by also having the cash injection. So the overall impact would be to overnight very drastically reduce the debt load on the economy and do not as much damage as you would do to aggregate demand if you simply abolish the debt and not penalise savers in the process, but definitely reduce the size and the power and influence of the financial sector.
All right, let me see if I'm following this. You're proposing that the central banks, and we'll just say here in the United States, the U.S. Federal Reserve, that their next quantitative easing would not be putting massive amounts of money into the banking system, into the finance system, but they would print money and give it to American citizens who would then be required to pay off their debts. Is that correct?
Effectively, I wouldn't say printing, I'd say electronically created, because of course
yes.
That's part of the myth, but yes. So you direct it to households via their bank accounts. If they had debt, then whatever injection would then go in would cancel part of that, would pay down the debt. Of course, the banks would then receive that money as an asset, so they would then, their loan level would fall, their cash level effectively would rise. So you'd not affect the solvency of the bank, but you would affect their liquidity.
What does that do to the value of the U.S. dollar?
Well, the value of the U.S. dollar is... every dollar on the planet is massively overinflated. The values of dollars are comparative to other currencies. And America is not the only country that's done this. In fact, even though I pointed out how bad America has been in terms of its aggregate private debt level, which exceeded 300% of GDP in 2009, whereas back in 1945 it was 45% of GDP. England, on the other hand, has 450% of GDP as its private debt level. So everybody in the world, virtually, every financial system has made the same mistake of letting Ponzi finance take over the financial system. So if they all do the similar thing, the relativities between currencies won't, you couldn't predict which way one currency would go against the other. And fundamentally, too, the real sense of the value of an economy is its capacity to produce and capacity to employ people. Now, the only reason the American economy is low value now is because that capacity has been destroyed by what the financial sector has done. So if you actually remove that obstruction, you'd actually be improving the real health of the American economy, and therefore, if it ultimately would affect the dollar, you might see it improving in value rather than falling.
Would this require all of the major central banks of the world coordinating this debt jubilee so that the China Central Bank, the Bank of England, European Central Bank?
I think you could do it on an individual basis. Of course, then you'd have all the interest, the dynamics of what happens with foreign currencies, of course. But for America, of course, at least America's debts are denominated in American dollars. So whatever it does with its debts don't affect its capacity to pay them to other people because they're still denominated in exactly the same currency. So America's in a fairly independent situation. It could go alone on this one. And then I think the possibility is that would then lead to other countries deciding they should consider a similar policy. One of my best examples there is what happened in Asia back in the Asian financial crisis. And one of the countries that went it alone was Malaysia with Mahathir, who gets all sorts of criticism for other factors, but he was being criticised as well by the conventional economists because he put up currency controls and insisted that the renminbi had to be returned to Malaysia, otherwise it would be written down in value, any foreign holdings, all sorts of currency controls, whereas of course the IMF was recommending open slather deregulation policies. And in fact, the country that came out of that crisis the best was Malaysia, which went it alone, went against conventional economic advice.
If the United States followed this example and canceled all debt, wouldn't the process just start all over again?
I wouldn't go for cancelling all debt, by the way. I'd go for reducing the amount of debt you could actually say was due to Ponzi lending rather than productive lending. Yes, it could, and that's why I've also proposed changes in the nature of financial assets themselves, because if you think about what debt is a fairly unpleasant thing. It's bizarre that we've got this much debt in existence. So the banks have persuaded us to regard debt as a good thing. And my analogy here is it's a bit like having a tooth pulled by the dentist. You only have as many teeth pulled as is actually necessary because it's painful, unless the dentist persuades you look sexier with less teeth.
Are you saying some mortgages would be paid off, others would not?
Oh no! I'll come back to the point. I'm saying locals would be paid off. What I'm thinking about is that we've made debt attractive by saying, yes, debt is a bad thing, and you've got to service it. But if you buy an asset with borrowed money and its price rises, you make a levered gain. So we have to remove the possibility of gambling on rising asset prices with borrowed money. And I have two other proposals there. One I call the PIL, which stands for Property Income Limited Leverage. And the other I call Jubilee shares. And the idea of the pill is that at the moment when you buy a house, if you and I are competing for the same house, both have the same income and the same savings, the one of us with the higher leverage wins.
Is there anybody in Washington or the New York Federal Reserve, which really controls the system, anybody taking this idea seriously?
Not yet, not in those situations, but I'm certainly finding people it's getting more currency than I thought it would do because I know it's a major shift in thinking. I'm certainly finding in Europe, people in Ireland, people in England, some in France are taking the idea seriously. A long way ahead of when I thought it would be taken seriously, frankly, because it's such a reversal of conventional thought.
Is the banking system as we currently know it, is it over?
It could be. The danger for banking is that banks make money they make profit by creating debt. They're always going to have a desire to pump out as much debt as they can manage, and the problem they then have to find is how do they persuade us to take on that debt. And if we simply borrow for consumption or we borrow for investment, we tend to be fairly responsible about the amount of borrowing we take on, which means the banks don't make as much profit as they like. They make the profit by persuading us to borrow to buy assets and get involved in flip that house games, and then we lose all reason because we're willing to borrow far more money than we could service in the belief that we're going to make a capital gain. So that tendency is always there in banking, and unless we can tame it, then yes, quite possibly people could look at reforms that would actually abolish the capacity of banks to create money in the very first instance, which is the sort of proposal that the American Monetary Institute has put forward.
Is there a global reset of currencies on the horizon?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's no way that the currency values at the moment reflect the productive capacity of the economies involved. I mean, the American on that front certainly is overvalued, and so for that matter is the Australian currency. The Chinese is probably massively undervalued. And part of what's going on behind all this financial shenanigans, of course, has been a global relocation of production, which really has benefited American I'll use the old Marxian term, American capitalists at the expense of American workers, because they've shipped the factories overseas, paid lower wages overseas, and brought the goods back and sold into a diminished market. So you've been deindustrialised to some extent by this process as well as Australia and England. And ultimately the industrial strength of your economy is where your true wealth lies. We don't make wealth by financial services. Obviously, it's more of a parasite. So you had a huge growth in the parasitic side of the American economy, the financial sector, which at various times have been responsible for 50% of the profits in the country. But that's parasitic profits. The real side of the American economy has been drastically diminished by this whole process, and we'll only find that out after we finally reduce the debt levels and just see what's left of the American economy in the process. It's not a pretty sight.
How do you envision this global reset of currencies to take place?
Chaotically. I would like to say there's a sensible way to do it, but the reality is we're going to see the same sort of chaos that applied during the Great Depression in terms of currency values and people, back in those days going on and off the gold standard. A similar thing is going to apply here. So countries which have their debts denominated in another currency, and that's unfortunately the situation of most of Europe, because they don't actually have their own currency. The euro is not owned by any of the European countries. They'll be breaking out of the euro and bringing back the drachma and bringing back the lira and so on until such time as what's left of the euro settles down to a sustainable currency region. And similarly, I think America will find that when it takes a good look at its industrial capacity, it needs to have a lower value of the dollar. China will be forced by reverse devaluations in some ways to break its peg with the American dollar. I think it'll be a mess because we never handle this stuff well.
What kind of devaluation of the U.S. dollar do you expect?
Oh, again, this is really putting my finger up to the wind here, but I'd say something of the order of 20 or 30%.
How soon do you think this is going to happen?
Oh, it could be over the next 5 to 10 years. These things happen suddenly when they happen. There's one of Keynes's most eloquent expressions, and by the way, Paul Krugman is not a Keynesian, no matter what he calls himself. Keynes is far more intelligent man than what we see passing itself as Keynesian economics these days. But Keynes once remarked that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And that's one of the great dangers. A currency can remain overvalued for longer than you can ever believe possible, and then it can plunge the day after you give up hope of it ever resetting. So I certainly wouldn't want to time these things. But
you don't see this global reset as happening, within months.
No. But I do see chaos on the currency markets, as you mentioned with the Greeks. If that Greek party that does sensibly want to not honour the austerity project, they actually win the majority and then break the austerity policy, which I'd be totally in support of them doing, then that could cause a cascade through the whole euro and lead ultimately to them deciding that they don't want to. They may decide to break away and recreate their own currency to maintain domestic circulation, and then all hell will break loose. So certainly I think the next 6 months to a year will be fascinating on that front. But a global reset which then settles down and we can then say it's all behind us, that could take 5 to 10 years.
Has the euro debacle put an end to the concept of monetary unions between nations?
I think it has. It is truly a debacle as well. If you read the Maastricht Treaty, as I did back when it first came out, I just thought this was a disaster waiting to happen because it was designed by the same economists who didn't see this crisis coming. They're called neoclassical economists, and Paul Krugman and Ben Bernanke and all that lot, Alan Greenspan are all in that camp. And they really believe that the economy is a self-balancing stable system that always turns to equilibrium or remains in equilibrium at all time, and the only disturbances are caused by bad trade unions, bad monopolies, or bad government, and therefore they tried to tie the hands of the Europeans in the euro. And the way they tied the hands was to say, well, with one currency you can't do exchange rate policy. With the currency controlled by a European Central Bank, you can't do monetary policy, and we're going to put limits on your deficits, therefore you can't do fiscal policy. And they naively believed that would lead to a perfect world. I took one look at it and thought, hell, this is madness, and as soon as any recession hits, they'll be forced to go into austerity when the economies will actually need a government stimulus. It'll cause chaos. But even I said that back in the first edition of Debunking Economics back in 2000, but even I didn't guess just how much chaos would actually be caused by this. And of course, unlike sensible people who'd look at this and say, this treaty was a piece of garbage to begin with, let's tear it up and do something more sensible, they're still trying to stick to the treaty, which is where they're causing so much more pain in Europe than is actually necessary.
Several years ago, Russian President Medvedev held up a gold coin for photographers and said, "This is the future global currency." Was that a publicity stunt, or does he know something that's coming?
I think it's a publicity stunt. I don't know the actual physical amount of gold in the world, but there's no way that I'd be buying my next Kindle e-book by sending Amazon a sliver of gold. What people talk about when they say a gold-based currency is they say one that's backed by gold or linked to gold in some irrevocable way. And there are a lot of people out there, gold bugs, who are quite in favour of that. I see gold as a speculative commodity which does well during times of financial crises, but not as an alternative money. And lots of reasons for that. But one of the key ones is we actually need some flexibility in our financial system to handle the sort of waves of innovation that can occur at various times, as Joseph Schumpeter argued, and that's an economist I have a great deal of respect for. And he argued quite sensibly that entrepreneurs actually need to have banks creating spending power for them to bring new ideas into being. And therefore you need that flexibility in the financial system that you get out of a credit-based system. But if you then tie it to gold, you then get crises based on the availability of the physical metal. And that was the case in the 19th century on various occasions. It is important, as James Ricard argues, to try to prevent the extent to which governments will try to manipulate a currency. And a gold standard is one way to attempt to do that between currencies. But it isn't going to lead to nirvana. I think there's a lot of people who naively believe it would.
When I listen to the talking heads on American TV news channels, it sounds like they're just waiting. Any day, things are going to settle down and we're going to go back to normal times. I don't see it ever returning.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Normal times mean an unsustainable trend. They want to go back to an unsustainable trend. You can't do it. This is what people don't realize about an unsustainable system. When it breaks down, you can't restart it again. So you get used to, in this case, an economy based on rising levels of debt compared to income, and believe that's the normal. And, of course, for you, it might be all you've experienced for your entire lifetime, because, as I pointed out, back in 1945, the private debt to GDP ratio in America was 45%. It's now 300. Well, you could have been born in 1945, and the age of 60, it's still growing. A bit like the old turkey that says, look, it's absolutely fantastic. Every day here I've been has been fantastic. The next day they chop your head off. So you can't go back to the unsustainable trend. Having hit 300% of GDP in 2009, it's since been reduced to about 250% of GDP. Now, to get back to what they think is normal, it needs to start accelerating again. But the only way it could would be if you could find a bunch of American borrowers who were naive enough to believe that if they borrowed money and bought assets, they'd make rising profits by playing flip that house or flip that share again. And fundamentally, it's not going to happen. It's going in the opposite direction. So, yes, it is just because they're not aware of what caused the problem in the first place, they can't see why the old days that they thought were normal are in fact the days of unsustainable growth and debt.
Well, here in the United States, the one factor that so many of the experts ignore is just plain simple demographics. We have the baby boomers, which I'm one of them. We are aging. We're leaving our productive years. We're headed towards retirement, and you've got this massive bubble that's moving through the system. It's like a rat going through the digestive tract of a snake. I mean, this thing's moving through the system.
Yeah, but look, Harry, you're dead right, and Harry Dent's the guy to follow on that front.
Yes, sir, and he's been a guest here on the program. He's got excellent insight on this.
He definitely has. I don't include demographics in my own analysis because if I did, it would swamp everything else. But Harry and I are definitely good friends. Definitely, I think he's absolutely correct to be pushing the demographics as a major additional factor. And of course, that means that you being a baby boomer, you're trying to sell your house and move into a smaller place. Well, that means and of course, if we're all doing it at once because there's more of us than there are the generation following, we're trying to flog more houses than there are buyers. So partly the trend that we saw of rising house prices has, as well as no longer having rising debt behind it, it's also got this special demographic bubble, meaning that the volume of people trying to sell and move into retirement and capitalise those gains has also risen. So, yeah, all sorts of reasons why we can't go back to the past.
That's right. And then you have the baby boomers who are moving, expecting to collect their retirement checks from the government, which the politicians spent that money decades ago. And so now you have a smaller group of young workers who are going to be expected to come up with the extra money to cover what the politicians stole.
So what's really the problem, though, is the fall in the productive capacity of the economy over time, because fundamentally you keep people who aren't working alive by the work of those who are working at the same time. So the idea you can accumulate a deficit in Social Security, I think, is misplaced. But it is the case that you have to have a productive capacity of current workers to sustain current non-workers. And, of course, there's two ends of the non-working spectrum. There are people who aren't yet born, and there are people who have already retired. Now, what we're going through is a transition where, in the past, most of those people who were not working, we were sustaining, were younger than us. Now they're going to be older than us. So that's not as big a shift as it appears to be overall, but it's still there. And the real problem is that in the meantime, we should have increased the productive capacity of those who are working. And one way to go about that would have been to develop robotics in the production systems and to industrialise so that we actually have more and more work being done by machinery as opposed to labour, and then share the benefits of that through the rest of society, both the workers and the non-workers. Now, because we've been caught up in this huge financial speculation, we haven't done it. To some extent, Japan has. Japan's got a far higher level of robots in its production system than anywhere else in the world. But that's what we should have done. It's pretty bizarre to imagine that a species as intellectually advanced as we are could be in a situation where we actually are falling over because we can't do the physical labour. When we're not digging holes with our hands anymore, we're using machines for it, and we should have been making that transition, and partly being caught up in this gigantic financial bubble, being seduced by Ponzi wealth, means we haven't done that development of the industry that we should have been able to do, and we could have therefore covered this demographic transition in our stride.
Is there a new economic system being birthed?
Not yet. I think we're going to have to have one because we are the real problem for us, as well as all this other things happening, is that the impact we're having on the ecology of the planet. Now, I know this causes all sorts of disputes between the people who believe global warming is happening and those who believe it's not happening. So the point I want to emphasise here is what's called the human ecological footprint. I would recommend people take a look at that. That's a way of measuring the amount of the planet each of us needs to stay alive, and it's a very simple set of well, not simple. It takes some intelligence to do it, but they sort of say how many acres do you need for food, how many effective acres do you need to dig holes in the ground to pull minerals out, what land load do you have out of a manufacturing plant, and so on. And using those calculations are quite reasonable calculations, saying how much of the planet are we using now? Because of course, with the sun coming in and plants growing, etc., the planet has a certain yield it can do, so that it's sustained. Productive capacity remains sustained over time. We are currently on the human ecological footprint using about 1 1/3 to 1 1/4 planets. Clearly we're mining the capacity of the planet right now. So at some stage we simply have to stop doing that. But of course when we do, we're carrying a population 1.5 times as large as it can actually sustain. Parts of us living a far wealthier lifestyle than it can in fact also be sustained. And at some point, we have to reorient production and the way we think about our presence on this planet to say unbridled profit can't be the ultimate goal. We have to be living within the ecological capacity of the planet, and that does mean a significant change in the nature of the economic system. But I think we haven't even thought about that yet at a collective level. That, again, I think will be forced on us by the types of failures one can expect when you're mining your resources rather than living off them.
All right, one final question. So are we looking at years or even decades of financial turbulence and uncertainty?
I think we are. Looking again at the Great Depression, the level of debt that began the Great Depression, in America's case, was 175% of GDP. That was the level of private debt compared to income. It then increased due to deflation, but then by the time you got through the Great Depression and the Second World War, which is about 15 years later, you were down to that very, very low level of 45%, and off went the boom of the 1950s. That's 15 years. Now, we're starting from 300% of GDP, about 1.7 times as much debt. And that, to me, implies that it could, if we actually went through a similar process to the last time around, hopefully not involving a bloke with a little moustache on his face in Germany and the Third World War, it could take 2 decades to get through this. And that's why I think we have to really think about a more sensible way to go about it, acknowledge the mistakes we've made, abolish that debt in a modern, sensible way, and then minimise the damage, but we still face something like at least a decade, I would say, of financial turmoil.
My guest today, economist Steve Keen. He's Associate Professor of Economics, University of Western Sydney. The book is Debunking Economics, and his website is debtdeflation.com. Professor Keen, thank you. Appreciate you being on True News today.
It was delightful, Rick. Thank you very much.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ, you're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast.
This is Max McLean. Are you aware of the power that God has made available to us who believe? Listen to the Bible from 2 Peter 1. Grace and peace be yours in abundance through the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord. His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature and escape the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. From 2 Peter 1. Listen to the Bible. It's great for the soul.
The Bible says that faith comes by hearing. Be able to hear the Word of God today and every day. To hear more, go to radiobible.org.
I need to correct myself. When I introduced Mr. Keen, I said he was an associate professor. That is not accurate. He is a full professor. That's my apology to Professor Keen. At the close of the interview, I asked him if we are looking at a long-term period of turbulence and uncertainty regarding the global financial system. And he said, yes. He said, if I recall, he said 10 to 20 years. Well, that bears witness with what I have been saying on this program for some time. This is not, what we are experiencing in the world right now is not something that is going away in a few months. This has already been underway since 2007, and here we are in 2012. We have another 10 to 20 years of turbulence in the world until a new financial system arises. Now, this is why I believe that we have quite some time until Jesus Christ returns. Now, in God's viewpoint, 10 to 20 years is just a speck of time. To us, we think it's a long time, but it isn't. There is a lot that must happen in the world. And so there is some type of new global financial system that is going to arise from the ashes of this debacle. And I would call it the phoenix. I think the phoenix will rise up from the ashes of the old financial system. Regardless, you and I have a job to do. We have been assigned by our commander, Jesus Christ, to make disciples of all nations. And He tells us to trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not unto our own understanding, but in all our ways acknowledge him, and he will direct our paths.